Hey guys, I'm in the library right now, so if I'm a little quiet, that's why. This is my video responding to your questions. Um, so what I'm gonna do is I have them up on the screen, so if I'm like looking sideways, that's why. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read the question from each of y'all, and then attempt to answer it. If I don't answer it adequately, please comment. That would be great. um, so we can try and clarify it even more, or you can just talk to me. I think all of you have my number, so if I don't answer your question adequately, you know, please comment on that. So thank you all for reading this. I hope it was somewhat enjoyable. So I'm going to start with, I'm just going to go through the questions. A lot of the questions were either clarification questions or um, expounding questions, elaboration questions. So I'm going to just filter through them right as they came in. And hopefully we can get some of this resolved. So the first question came from Roz. And Roz, you asked, was there anyone in your research that suggested the word and wisdom were synonymous for the sun? I have heard people argue Proverbs 8 as a Christological passage in which the sun is saying as wisdom that he was present at creation as well. I think that O'Collins, in the initial article, the one that I referenced at the very beginning, the one that I'm kind of challenging, actually tries to make that connection. I don't know that he does it perfectly, but I definitely think he tries to do that. He wants to connect wisdom and word, and that is his idea of the second person of the Trinity in the Old Testament. So his Old Testament Trinitarian view is God as Father, wisdom and word, and um, the Spirit. So yes, I think that he wants to connect wisdom and word as the Logos. I don't remember that he actually references Proverbs 8. There were a lot of artists. Wow, there were a lot of artists. There were a lot of scholars who do reference Proverbs 8. Excuse me, and um, they. I don't know if they would argue that that's a Christological passage. I think Longman III probably would, which I'll deal with him more when I talk about Tim's question. But I think Longman III would look at that as a Christological passage because of the connection between the New Testament and the Old Testament. I mean, he thinks that you can read the New Testament in light of, read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. So he would probably read that as a Christological passage. I don't think there was anybody else who would say it's Christological, but they would definitely see it as connecting wisdom and word, and then maybe through a series of arguments and logical progression, you can come up with, oh yeah, he's referencing Christ here, or the author, whoever it is referencing Christ here. But I don't think it's, strictly speaking, a Christological passage. But yes, O'Collins wants wisdom and word to be his Old Testament connection to the Son found in the New Testament. Like I said, it's God as Father, wisdom and word, and the Spirit. So yes, that does happen. And actually, he spends, O'Collins, spends most of his time, I think, with wisdom and word. Most of it with wisdom, but a lot of it with the wisdom and word dualistic, is that the right word? Dualistic paradigm. And trying to show that trying to show that those two things are functioning together, which I think he would connect to the Son. Where I find fault with O'Collins is his talking about the Spirit, because what he actually says in his writing that oftentimes the work of the Spirit is synonymous with the work of wisdom and word. And the problem that I had with that was that seems to undermine what the Spirit is actually supposed to be doing. So if all you have with the Spirit is a further elaboration of wisdom and word, then it seems like you're kind of short-arming the Spirit. And the problem I think you have with that is that might make the Spirit not quite a divine personification, which I think O'Collins would want to have in order to make there be divine persons in the New Testament idea of the Trinity. So that's where I think he goes wrong. I think, yes, he makes wisdom and word synonymous with the Son, but I think he works too hard or makes the case too strongly that the Spirit, while its own thing, is doing synonymous work with wisdom and word. I think that that's problematic, and that's essentially what I'm challenging. Excuse me, coffee. So, I mean, can you read Proverbs 8 as Christological? I think if you look at it through a Longman III lens, probably. I don't know if O'Collins would want to do that, but maybe. So if you look at those two authors, then perhaps that could resolve your question. I hope. Okay. The second question is from Tim, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's kind of long, but it's a clarification question, and just the thrust of the question is, you say that Longman III's argument is that the Spirit of God is actually another way to talk about the right hand of God. After this claim, you ask how this fits with Hildebrandt's ordering of the Spirit. Hildebrandt says that the Spirit is the one who gives wisdom rather than being synonymous to wisdom, so the Spirit would precede wisdom, which is correct. In a later paragraph, you say Hildebrandt also argues that wisdom precedes the Spirit by pouring out her Spirit onto those who listen to her words. You say that these arguments are contrary to each other, but I'm not quite seeing it. Okay, that's a good clarification. So I'm going to look at my actual DLB, because I don't have the thing memorized, and try and resolve this issue. So, Longman, this might be a writing problem on my part, but Longman isn't okay. Longman is not proposing that the Spirit of God is synonymous with the hand of God. He is proposing that Walton is actually indicating that. That might have been lost in the writing a little bit, but that's not Longman III's actual assertion. He is rather saying Walton isn't indicating any kind of presence of the Holy Spirit, but rather that the Spirit of God is synonymous with hand of God, and therefore the Spirit in the creation narrative of Genesis 1 should not be considered any kind of separate entity or the separate entity of the Holy Spirit. That's what Longman III is arguing. So, that's how that works. It's Longman who makes the opposite move. So that's what Longman is saying about John Walton's view. It's Longman who makes the alternate move of Hildebrandt. So Hildebrandt wants to say that, let me scroll up here and find it so that I can just read it for you. So Wilf Hildebrandt would seem to argue against that strict of a distinction between wisdom and spirit in creation, seeing the Spirit as the one who gives wisdom and wisdom as the one who orders the creative acts. So they're divine personifications, but it is the Spirit who is the prerequisite, I think is the term that I use, for wisdom. The Spirit gives wisdom, then wisdom orders creation. But the Spirit comes first. I think Longman makes the opposite move, suggesting that wisdom, in the form of Lady Wisdom, or he says woman wisdom. I don't like that as much, but he suggests that it's Lady Wisdom who appears pouring out her spirit to everyone who listens to and heeds her words. So, while Hildebrandt wants to say the Spirit is the prerequisite for wisdom in the creative act in Genesis, Longman comes along and says, well, actually, in this passage, it's wisdom who is the prerequisite for the Spirit. So Lady Wisdom comes first and pours out her spirit upon anyone who will listen. I think one of the problems with that particular view of Longman's, or it might not be a problem with Longman's view, but I think the temptation is to read that spirit as the Holy Spirit, and I'm not sure that that's what's happening. I mentioned somewhere else in my, it may be in the next paragraph or even in the same paragraph, that spirit that's being poured out should not be understood as the Holy Spirit, but rather the Spirit of wisdom. So it's a different concept, lowercase s, the Spirit, not capital S, Spirit. So rather than saying, well, Lady Wisdom in this passage is preceding Spirit, and therefore is preceding the Spirit, and therefore, excuse me, we ought to read wisdom as some kind of superior or something. I think we have to be careful about which spirit are we looking at. Which spirit is the one really being dealt with? And I think that the spirit that's really being dealt with in Longman's passage is the spirit of wisdom. However, by way of contrast, I think in Hildebrandt's ordering, I think we are dealing with wisdom and the Spirit, capital S. So I think as far as Hildebrandt is concerned, you have two entities, wisdom and spirit. And even if he would say, well, Lady Wisdom is the same wisdom that appears in the Proverbs passage that Longman uses, it's not. There's still a distinction, one, between spirit and wisdom. So it's not the spirit of wisdom is preceding wisdom. It's the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit, is preceding wisdom. And so I think two different spirits are being discussed, but the opposite moves are being made, where you have wisdom pouring out the Spirit or pouring out her spirit, the spirit of wisdom, and the Spirit preceding wisdom. So the Spirit is there who gives wisdom, and then wisdom orders creation. I think that's what's happening. But the two separate moves that are being made are by Hildebrandt and Longman III. So Hildebrandt is saying the Spirit in creation precedes or gives wisdom, and then wisdom orders creation. Longman III says Lady Wisdom in Proverbs. So that's the Hildebrandt one is from Genesis. Whereas Longman III would say, well, Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, Lady Wisdom precedes the outpouring of the Spirit, or of the Spirit of wisdom, on all who listen to and heed her words. So I think those are the two things, the two moves that are being made. But again, I think we have to question what kind of spirit is being discussed here. So is the spirit of wisdom the same spirit as the Spirit in Genesis? I don't know. I don't think so. I think that we have two different spirits being discussed. Excuse me. And we ought to take that into account when we're dealing with how we interpret Proverbs and Genesis. I don't think that we should necessarily read them as the same spirit. Now, the question comes in when you take into things like, so one of the problems that we have is Longman talks about the spirit of wisdom, or rather, Lady Wisdom pouring out the spirit of wisdom, and you have the same kind of connection being made in Joel 2:28, where it says, "I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh." And I think what's being done, it's a clever rhetoric, but I think what's being done is you have Lady Wisdom saying, "I'll pour out the spirit of wisdom, so I'll give wisdom to whoever listens to and heeds my words." I think in Joel, what you have is God saying, "I will pour out my spirit." So now you have two different spirits being talked about altogether. You have Lady Wisdom saying, "I'll give my spirit of wisdom to whoever listens to and heeds my words," but then you'll have the spirit of, you have God saying, "I'll pour out my spirit," God's spirit, which is to say the Holy Spirit upon all flesh. Excuse me. And so I think that's where the big distinction comes in. It's not in the pouring out, it's in the move being made, or in the prerequisite ordering. It's in the who is giving the spirit. Wisdom versus God. Lady Wisdom versus God's direct spirit. And so I think that's two things being talked about. The real distinction that has to be made. I hope that was clear. I'm not sure if it was. If not, comment, or, we're both in the library all the time. You can come down here and see me if you want. We can talk about it. Ryan, you mentioned a dichotomy between the model presented by Hildebrand and Walton. On the one hand, the argument offered by Longman and the argument offered by Hildebrand and Walton on one hand, and the argument offered by Longman on the other. The first view seems to be that the spirit is a prerequisite condition. We talked about this for the one who gives wisdom, and Longman is the wisdom who's pouring out the spirit, not spirit is a source of wisdom. I just talked about that, how I'm not sure those spirits are the same, but we talked about that. The reason that I ask whether there must be this dichotomy is that both seem to be describing economic functions of wisdom and spirit. If that is the case, as many have done, wisdom can be equated to the Logos and Son. We talked about that with Roz's question, and I think that's what O'Collins does. Then what we have in creation is the spirit empowering creation through the Son. Moreover, Lady Wisdom pouring out the Spirit can be read as a prophecy for the sending of the Spirit into the world by the Son. Joel. The two passages need not be read as descriptions of the immanent Trinity. Did any of your sources attempt to make such a distinction, or is there an assumed correspondence between economic and immanent? I think that there's an assumed distinction, or it could just be that they're trying to figure out the economic functions of how economically, since traditionally the economic Trinity is how we learn things about the Trinity, and we're specifically looking at the Old Testament. I think that they may specifically be looking at the economic functions to seeing how, okay, well, if we can have these economic functions, what does that say about the immanent? So I think that it's both. I think that they're kind of talking, they're specifically trying to find the economic functions, but I also think there's an assumed correspondence between economic and immanent. I think I like the dichotomy, but I think one of the issues is, again, what spirit is being poured out in the Proverbs passage. In Joel, I think it's pretty clear that the spirit being, now Ross can correct me on this because he's the Old Testament scholar, but I think it's pretty clear that in Joel, the spirit being poured out is God's, that is the Holy Spirit, and so I think that there's that economic connection of God pouring out the Spirit, and that Spirit being God's. I think wisdom isn't pouring out the Spirit. Maybe, but I'm not sure that would be an accurate reading of Proverbs. the reason that can get fuzzy, as I've mentioned, is because of the pouring out statements that come in both Joel and in Proverbs. So, because Joel also says, I'll pour out my spirit, and Proverbs says, I'll pour out my spirit, I think there's a temptation to read them crossed. Now, the interesting part is that because wisdom and word are read so closely together, especially by O'Collins, if we want to make that a representation of the Son, then you would have both the Son giving the Spirit of wisdom and the Holy Spirit. And so they could both be read as potentially Christological texts, but not necessarily. But I think your dichotomy is a good one if the spirits are the same, but I'm not sure that they are. I'm not sure Lady Wisdom is actually offering the Holy Spirit, but rather the Spirit of Wisdom. And to answer your question, like I said, both. I think that they're searching for economic functions while taking into account this assumed correspondence between economic and immanent trinities. And then to your observation, yeah, I think you're right. I think Longman III makes a pretty standard statement about how it's not wrong to read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, especially for clarifications. I just think that the temptation is to make it really strong. So like, oh, this says spirit, therefore it means this spirit that we have this has spirit in the Old Testament, and therefore it must be the same spirit we experience in the New Testament narrative, and that's simply not the case. Not always the case. I think we have to be very careful, and by careful I mean critical in the positive sense about which Old Testament spirit is really being talked about, and then use our New Testament understanding of the Holy Spirit accurately and adequately. And when we do that, then I think, yeah, it's perfectly fair reading. So, yeah, to answer your observation, yeah, I think that's perfectly fine as long as we're cautious and careful and critical about how we do it. But that's all the questions. I hope I've answered them all. If I haven't done so adequately, like I said, text me, comment, come see me. We can talk about it. But thank you all for reading it. Thank you all for listening. And I hope you have a good summer. Thanks.